So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, because we have both sides represented today. Good morning and good afternoon from Denmark, where I'm present right now. My name is Victoria Bajer. I work at the Consulate General of Denmark in New York. I'm part of the organizing team behind this three-part webinar series, The Gender Effect at Work, where we invite influential speakers from the Nordics and United States to discuss this important agenda. Now, during our third and final webinar, Women in Corporate Leadership, Boosting Corporate Performance with Gender Diverse Leadership, our moderator and expert panel, they will share insights and diverse perspective on how to improve and provide concrete actions that accelerates progress towards women's equal participation in leadership positions. Now, this webinar is co-hosted and organized by the Consulates of Denmark and Sweden in New York in partnership with New York City Economic Corporation and in cooperation with the Consulates of Finland, Iceland, and Norway. And most importantly, we are grateful for the support that we have received from the Nordic Council of Ministers to power this webinar series. Now, a couple of practical notes before we get started. First, this webinar will be recorded for promotional use. Second, your lines have been muted and your video turned off. Sorry about that. We can't see all your beautiful faces. It will only be the moderator and the panelists who have their cameras on today. Now, we will have in the end an open discussion in the end. So please utilize the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit all your questions. Now, the agenda for today, as mentioned, and a brief introduction, our Ambassador Berit Basse from Denmark will be giving the opening remarks. Then we'll tune in to listen and have an introduction by Nadras, who is our moderator today. Then we'll open up for our discussion, and finally we'll have the Q&A as mentioned, where we'll take all your questions. Again, thank you so much for our partners that you see the logos on here. We have today Denmark present, we have Norway, we have Sweden, and we have United States. First and foremost, before we get to our panel, I would like to welcome Ambassador Berit Basse, Consul General of Denmark in New York, to give a couple of opening remarks. Berit?
Thank you so much, Victoria. And hi to all dear panel and viewers. Also from me, welcome this webinar on the gender effect at work, women in corporate leadership, boosting corporate performance with gender diverse leadership. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to open the discussion today on a topic which I also myself is engaged in, having worked at an executive level for many years as a diplomat. And actually, just the other day, a friend of mine called to ask if I could recommend a good combined high school and soccer club in New York City for her 13-year-old son. She'd been looking online and was annoyed that the school she had been recommended was an all-girls school. An all-girls school, how is that such gender discrimination even possible in 2021, she complained, and went on saying that soccer really was not a girls' sport anyway. And although my friend's standpoint may seem out of sync with the politics and sentiments of today's modern society, I do know where she's coming from, which is really the same place as a large part of my generation. Men and women who have grown up with various affirmative action strategies and initiatives at school, at university, and in the workplace, in that battle towards diminishing the historically founded patriarchal structures of society. The Western workplace really has tried to, as David Bowie once sang, put out the fire with gasoline. We have in a way made more conducive conditions in order to end the discrimination that women throughout history have been subjected to just because they were women. And therefore, you might wonder, after over 100 years of affirmative action strategies worldwide, women's movements and powerful human rights programs, after groundbreaking and game-changing social media phenomenon as Me Too or Throw Like a Girl, while debating imbalances and the need for diverse workplaces today. I think there's really only one answer to that question, and that's because the problem of inequality is still not fixed. Inequality still exists. Unconscious bias is not a thing from the past, but something we should work actively to recognize and understand and eliminate. There are glass ceilings hovering over our global workplace environments, preventing workers from enhancing or developing their skills just because of their gender. I myself, born and raised in one of the wealthiest and happiest nations of the world, Denmark, which is the Legoland of welfare and equal opportunity, known for its progressive politics and high standards of living and social security. But even in Denmark, we're not quite there. For example, in my own ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the group of posted ambassadors, we are only 30% women. And that is despite the fact that gender equality has been a focus and priority for many years. Also in Denmark, women still take the majority of parental leave, where a third of Danish fathers choose not to take leave, and that results in a lifelong inequality in wages and pension. And also when it comes to wages, overall, women still make 22% less than men and 4.6% less for the same work. In Denmark, as a curiosity, out of Denmark's 134 listed companies, there are more CEOs who are named Lars than CEOs who are women. So although I was a little shocked initially by my friend's reaction to the fact that a son, due to his gender and not his soccer skills, was prevented from applying to this all-girls school, I knew that the school's efforts might work to create more equality in a longer perspective. In addition, I know that such an affirmative action strategy merely is just one tool towards achieving a more gender-balanced workplace at every level. Always is worth the effort, although we might argue and disagree strongly. In the workplace, we simply cannot afford not to use the potentials of all genders. And therefore, I'm also looking very much forward to hear our panelists share the actions they've taken in their respective companies to accelerate diversity and women's access to leadership positions. I do hope also that all of you who are interested in gender discussions and who are right now eager to listen to our panel of experts that we have with us here today, that you will contribute to the exchange of ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Beat. I'm happy that you're bringing real life cases and stories to this, and I'm sure we'll hopefully agree and disagree on many points now. Moving on to our moderator of today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Lauren Nadras, who is the Assistant Vice President of New York City Economic Corporation. And I know you have been with us on our last webinar as well. So we're happy to have you today. Now, Lauren, a couple of words of your experience, because I know you have 15 years of experience in international economic development, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And I know that you've been working with leading global institutions like the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, and the UN, United Nations. I also know that you have been working at a tech startup, and you have been with an international consulting. Sorry, here we have you. And you have been with an international development consulting firm. Now, 3 fun facts. You have traveled nearly, was it 80 countries, survived triathlons, and you've climbed Mount Everest base camp, something like that. I think I'll give the word to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Victoria, for that kind introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you so much to Ambassador and Consul General for the opening remarks and setting the stage so beautifully for us and our discussions today. Sweden and Denmark and other fellow Nordic countries have been such leaders on the gender equity front, to say the least. And it's a shared value for us here in New York City and something that we're continually striving for. And it's an honor for us at EDC, which is short and our loving way of calling New York City Economic Development Corporation shortly, is to co-host and partner in this important initiative on gender effect at work and discussions on solutions, creating a gender inclusive economy, including today's important topic, women in corporate leadership, boosting corporate performance with gender diverse leadership. On behalf of EDC, our sincere thanks to our co-hosts, partners, and organizing team, Consulates General of Denmark, Sweden, and New York, in cooperation with the Consulates of Finland, Iceland, Norway, and the Nordic Council of Ministers. And I have to say special thanks to the power women that have made this happen. Victoria, Elizabeth Martin with the Consulate General of Denmark, and Annette and Barbara with the Consulate General of Sweden. Thank you, they are amazing. I shared this at the last webinar, but since we don't have the same folks today, and I'll just give a quick introduction about EDC and a snapshot of New York City's economy at this time, and link that to our discussion today as far as gender parity in the corporate and the boardroom, and then do an introduction of our panelists. In brief, EDC is a mission-driven organization that promotes and implements economic development across the city. And we aim to have shared prosperity across the city. And inclusion and equity is very much at the core and anchor of what we do. Regarding New York City economy to date, we've been through a lot, as many of you know, and as all of us have been through a lot. But there are cities and there's New York City. The diversity and connectivity, entrepreneurial spirit, and the sheer scale make it a center of commerce and culture and innovation. Despite having been the epicenter of the global pandemic early on, which all of us here that lived through will never forget, we also know and feel that today's New York City's economic recovery is pulsating across the city. I literally see it outside my doorstep right now. I have to close all the windows just to make sure that there aren't too many buzzing in the background for us today. With a GDP of approximately $1.8 trillion, if New York City was a country, its economy would be the 10th largest in the world. New York has 54 of Fortune 500 companies headquartered here. Overall, Fortune 500 companies make up 66% of the nation's total GDP and a combined 14.2 trillion in revenues. Hence, given NYC EDC's inclusion and equity agenda, today's discussion is important to us to continue learning and improving on gender equity front, and to do it fast. After all, we are known for a New York minute, quote unquote. And frankly, on this front, we all need to move faster. So I know you're excited on hearing the amazing panel of corporate leaders that we've got here today, and from Nordic countries and New York City. And let's kick off our Q&A discussion with a few highlights and to also help frame the discussion. Let us, as the Ambassador and Consul General did, let's start off by not sugarcoating things, right? Despite the advances of women, the top of the corporate and boardrooms is very still much a boys' club. According to Business Insider article, at Fortune 500 companies, many of them here in New York City, women only account 17% of board members, 15% of C-suite executives, and 5% of CEOs. Catalyst, a research organization, found that even when women did all the things they're supposed to do in order to move up, communicate their desire to ascend corporate hierarchy, network with influential leaders, work extra hours and negotiate, raises and promotions, they were less likely than men to reap the benefits of their advancements strategies. Now, there was something that the research director of Catalyst said that really resonated with me, and I want to kick off with this to help frame our discussions today. She said, while Lean In has elevated the conversation about women at work, it's also important to note that this is not about fixing women. It's really about fixing workplaces. It's not asking why aren't women advancing, but why aren't the men at the top of these companies and boardrooms inviting women into the conversation? And might I add to that is, what are the structural challenges and solutions to correct this? I have personally, I'm very committed to this topic. I have 2 daughters, so I'm also keen to know that the discussions that we're having today is not something that they're going to have years down the road. With that said, let's jump right in, and no one better to kick us off than Marianne. So first speaker today is Marianne. She is a board member at TDC Group and DFDS. Marianne has managed Microsoft's Western European area team since July 29, covering the E2E Microsoft business across 14 countries. Prior to her current role, she was the country manager for Denmark and Iceland for 4 years. Under her leadership, the subsidiary crossed the $1 billion milestone and became the leader in early 2019 as one of the first markets to cross this important milestone worldwide. The subsidiary became the tech player with the best customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and image in the Danish tech market under her leadership. Before joining Microsoft, Marianne held leadership positions in telco and insurance, leading successful turnarounds across B2B and B2C. Marianne started as strategy consultant at Accenture in 1999. Warm welcome, Marianne.
Thank you, Lean, and thank you for having me today and putting focus on this important matter. As you were kind to say, I joined my professional career 22 years ago, and this topic was already back then top of the agenda. And we talked a lot about diversity already in the last century of last century. So it's definitely not a new topic. And therefore, it's also a topic that will require that we work from it from many angles to solve it. And I will speak both from a leadership position, but also from a board position today. Excellent.
Well, there is nobody else more apt to do that than you. You've got such amazing background, Marianne. And you've worked across several industries and with some of the largest corporations in the world, very much at leadership and top of your game. So what are 2-3 specific questions that you've seen or wish to see corporations do that is most impactful to structurally improve the gender balance in corporate leaderships and boards?
Yeah. And thank you for that. And first, I'm very happy to see that we have gender diversity in this panel. Very often the diversity discussion is a discussion among females, and that the first thing that I can say will definitely go wrong is when it's only one gender having the discussion or one whatever in any equality discussion. So I'm very happy to have Lars Erik and Jonas here, and I think that is number one thing for me to put focus on actually is that this is not about women, it's about people. And for us to create the future workplace, we need to have men and women equally involved in this topic. Secondly, as I said before, we need to work across the entire pipeline. We need to work, and Microsoft, we have been very active in working in inspiring young girls and young women into tech, but also into leadership. We have been introducing things like Coding Pirates, where we are introducing for 5th graders how to work with technology, and also by that to gain interest and desire to go into where the future leadership positions are. Also to work with making sure we have a good gender diversity into our graduates. That's where it all starts. Into our early management positions and into the returning from maternity leave. And last but not least, of course, making sure we have gender diversity at the executive levels. So it really is across the board. And also one place where I think it sometimes goes wrong is when we focus too much on gender diversity in the board or at C-level. We need to make sure it's end to end in our pipeline. So that's topic number 2. And then thirdly, if I were to point to one thing that I've seen given the biggest impact, we had for 1.5 years in Microsoft in Western Europe, where we implemented the practice that when you were recruiting a non-diverse talent, it were in most functions females, but in some like marketing and HR, it was actually men. Then you had to do, as a leader, as a hiring manager, you had to do a written explanation sent to me and the HR lead on why. And there were 2 things about that. First of all, it's always easier to recruit the majority gender, but by having to put in this extra step in the process when you were hiring a male or you were making it harder to do the easy thing. But it also made the hiring manager having to reflect over his or her own biases. So it really made people much more likely to recruit a female than a male or a male than a female in those, because it forced us to challenge our own unconscious biases. And there, I think it's important to remember that women has the same unconscious biases around women as men has. So female leaders are not necessarily better at requiring females than males are. So it's equally important to have females leaders to do this self-reflection. So that were my 3 tips. When women and men equally involved, work end to end in the talent pipeline. And then this little hack that proved to be very successful is to force people to reflect over their own biases in the recruitment situation.
That's excellent, Marianne. I love it. I love it. And that last part also, I think it's a great add-on and a great hack to have to check each of our biases when we're going through that process. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. Next, we're going to go to Lars Erik, who's currently is a leader and people culture leader and sustainability of organizations at Ikea. Lars Erik Fridolfsson is an experienced talent manager with a demonstrated history of working in retail industry, skilled in negotiation, talent management, HR consulting, coaching, and employee engagement. Strong human resources professional, graduated from Lund University. So we'll have a lot of HR insights and what are other hacks that we can have in there. Sure. Lars Erik has been working in Ikea for 20 years in different HR roles across the organization. In 2021, Lars Erik started working the range development organization and moved on to the purchasing organizations, which being responsible for the Southeast Asia organization living in Vietnam. Later on, Lars Erik moved on to work in India, South Asia, and was part of the initial startup of Ikea Retail in India. Amazing background. Welcome, warm welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
And our first question for you is that Ikea has a presence globally. You've had incredible and direct experience working IKEA offices around the world. And I shared this last time, I'm sitting on an IKEA couch. So
yeah, great.
How does IKEA ensure gender balance across its corporate offices in Sweden and its offices globally? And then a kind of a 2-part question for you on that, Lars Erik, is similar to the very targeted solutions that Marianne shared with us, is what are 1 or 2 specific approaches and how do you measure your progress?
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine, for introduction and also the questions you are putting here. I think the first thing we are talking about is the why question. Actually, why are we working with it? Because we all know that to have the why, it triggers the motivation also. And when we talk about the why here, it's very linked to our corporate values. I would say that we talk about togetherness as one of our key values, and inside. The definition of that value is diversity and inclusion as one very important part. And so we say it goes with our values of togetherness to work with different kinds of diversity. And that, of course, is also the gender part. And we believe in diversity. We truly believe in diversity and what it brings to the organization. And that is the first thing of the why. We know I mean, we are a product development company. We product develop 9,500 products that we have in our range. And you need creativity, and you can't get that from having a non-diverse organization. So you need diversity there. We also need, so creativity is there for one thing. We also know from a customer base, if we want to understand our customers as a big retailer, if you look, it's the majority, it's more women than men that shop at IKEA, and no surprise maybe, but that's how it is. And if you don't take care of that part, mirroring the customer base, then you also have a problem. So that's another why. We also believe in decision making, having different perspectives on things, the female side, the male side, and other parts of diversity as well. It's one very important part. And we believe in equal opportunities. It's a human right, and this is what we stand for. So, I mean, I think the why is my starting point. The second thing is I feel that it's so important that when you talk about diversity, you also talk about inclusion, because I have seen sometimes, and even in our organization, that it becomes a number thing. Say, but we are 50-50, so we are off to go now. Yeah, but that doesn't really make the trick. What do you do with that then, that you have the diversity? What do you do with that you have different perspectives? And if you don't work on the inclusive part, meaning like, how do we embrace these differences? How do we learn how to cope with the first unconscious bias and bring them into conscious understanding of each other's perspectives? Then you could end up like diversity doesn't really help. It could even go the wrong way. So diversity and inclusion is also very important. And I mean, the last thing is, of course, also that you work with like the goals and follow up. And then to your question more about how we specific approaches, I like very much what you said, Marianne, that you need to have a systematic view on it. And I think you need to first see, how does your system look like in the organization? If you don't have a recruitment and succession system that works, that supports this, if all your deputies are male and your successors are male, then for the CEOs and so on, then you have end up like in a systematic problem. So you need to look at the whole process of recruitment, succession, competence development, and so forth. Another organizational part you need to look into is also the corporate values. As I said, the values. I mean, are they in sync with working with diversity and inclusion or not? So that is on the operation or on the strategic level, you can say, organizational level. Then you need to look at the co-worker level. If you have fantastic system, but you don't have co-workers or employees who are prepared to embrace this and to say that, yes, it makes sense to work with diversity. I will take the effort on looking at other perspective, using emotional intelligence, empathy, and other things that we say is important to be inclusive. And also the values of the co-workers and the employees then. So you have on a system level to have the structuring control, and you have on the co-worker, we talk co-worker in Ikea, employee level. And these need to play together. So it is kind of a system, that ecosystem that needs to work. I think with this, I think that is kind of the overarching thinking we have around diversity, how we work with it, and which trigger then the right diversity with the gender equality as a part.
No, that's excellent, Laura. Yes, no, that's fantastic. And I like the ecosystem approach of it, and it being anchored on the value system. Yeah. But then you also connect it to the consumer base and the market and innovation, right? Yeah. One of the, you mentioned that really resonates with me is the diversity, not just for the sake of diversity, but then also in addition to that is the inclusion aspect, right? Yeah. Not just for the numbers. If I may go deeper into that, on the inclusion aspect, what kind of things do you do to ensure that not just the numbers are, we're 50-50 or, we have full gender parity? Yeah. How do you measure the inclusion aspect?
Yeah, we measure it. One part we do is through our employee surveys. That is one thing. And we actually have the question, do you feel included? That is a strong and powerful question. That is kind of straight on. And it gives us one part. And then we look into the data around it as well. But we ask these questions clearly out. And do you feel included? Do you feel that you can be yourself at work? Do you feel respected? These questions we have, because they are the questions that will answer if you feel included or not. So yeah, so that is an important part. And then you need to educate. I mean, this is about educate yourself in being like it is linked to emotional intelligence to be inclusive. You need to work on the different aspects of emotional intelligence, and that is something you don't have it, just have it. You need to work with it.
Right. And I imagine that because it starts from the value and the culture, that also then permeates across the organization. Thank you so much. Thanks, Lazar. Okay, so next wonderful speaker that we've got is Jonas. Jonas is a global head of corporate governance in Norges Bank Investment Management. He is responsible for engaging with 9,000 portfolio companies on good governance and voting at all shareholder meetings. Jonas joined, is it NBIM? In October 2016. Prior to joining NBIM, Jonas was a management consultant for McKinsey & Company in New York. Welcome, fellow New Yorker. Supporting clients in the financial industry. He worked as a Norwegian diplomat in the Middle East and the United Nations headquarters in New York City as well. A retired Army officer, he served in NATO peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. Jonas holds a PhD in modern languages from the University of Oxford, and he is a Norwegian citizen. Although a New Yorker at heart, I would suppose as well too.
Always, Lauren, always.
Welcome, welcome. Good to see you. And thanks so much for joining us today. So Jonas, you've got an amazing background, and as far as on the work front, Norway's 1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest, invests in 9,000 plus companies worldwide across 70 countries. So very diverse portfolio you've got there. As an influential stakeholder in many companies, to what extent does the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund influence or calls on companies and invest in to boost gender diversity requirements in their boards and or corporate leadership?
Thank you for the question, and glad to see so many people join this webinar today. We start in the boardroom, and the reason for starting in the boardroom is because we're invested in 9,000 companies, and we can't monitor each company. So we have to rely on strong boards to set the strategy and monitor management performance. But we see when we look at corporate boards across the globe, we see that 70% of companies have boards without a single woman. So the composition of boards is severely skewed. And of course, it depends a little bit on the region and the country, but even in so-called developed economies, we see boards without any women. And we believe that diversity essentially is good for the board for the same reason that Lars-Erik said. Diversity brings different perspectives and improves the decision-making process of the company. We also think that diversity is increasingly important for the legitimacy of the company. Do you really trust a company if the board is made up all of men? But the other side is also true, that if we see a company with a board where there are no women, that leads me to question, how good of a process did they have for identifying the best people to sit on that board? Did they just recruit people who looked exactly like the people who've been sitting there for the last 40 years? And that's a severe risk to us as an investor, because that's, we run the risk of groupthink, of complacency, lax oversight, because they all agree, and, cliches, they would play golf together, be friends from university or whatever, but not a group that has different perspective, challenges each other and challenges management. So briefly, what we do is we set clear expectations. We say board should try to have at least 30% gender balance. And by that, I mean 30% women. I've never seen a board where it's been a problem to find 30% men. So clear expectations. And then we use this in our conversation with companies. We say, well, we noticed your board is made up of so many men and women. Why is that? Do you have a plan to transition? Who are the new people you want to bring into the board? And the third thing we do is voting. Last year, we started looking at large multi-billion-dollar companies in the US and in Europe without any women on the board. I won't name names, but we found 16 companies. These are some of the largest companies in the world. And we decided to vote against the nomination committee, said that, you haven't done a good enough job. This year, we're looking for companies that don't have at least 2 women. So we're doing this step by step and identifying outliers, if you want. And we're starting in those companies or in those countries that really should know better. So that's with clear expectations, dialogue with companies, and using our power as a shareholder with a vote. That's how we try to advance better diversity in the boardroom.
No, that's great, Jonas, and that's extremely helpful. And also, with the idea that you brought up on groupthink, right? It's if you're exactly. All. It might be more conflict, there might be more conflict in a more diverse board of group members. But then if you're all the same thinking, it's actually that you're all not, you're all saying yes, 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 but then you could be totally missing a whole big part of, and that's a huge risk.
Absolutely,
that's a huge risk, right? You're completely missing a whole, as Lars-Erik was saying, a whole consumer base that you have no idea about, but you're enjoying the chat about the same point that you both agree on at the golf course.
Exactly, and if I can just share one more insight. Please. In France, when the government adopted a 40% gender 40%, quota, 40%, and this is the government doing it. So they can set hard quotas for at least 40% women on the board. What we found out as well is that the male candidates to the boards also changed, because the boards and the companies had to look in different places, maybe different schools, maybe not just like top level, but second level, to find women who were moving up. And then suddenly all these other men came up. So gender quotas can actually promote other kinds of diversity also within male board members. So we strongly believe that diversity has all kinds of other positive side effects.
Yes, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think we're going to touch on the quota discussion today as well too. But if I may just have a follow-up question on the aspect of, when you do bring up to, I'm curious of what the reaction is and what the action after is with companies that you speak with, right? So no names, but when you say that, you have got to diversify your boards, what's the initial reaction, and what's the most common action after that?
Well, I would say the reaction is fairly typical. That they would say, well, it's very hard to find women with that kind of background. So that's the first one. The second one is harder, saying, well, there's so much going on at the company now, we don't really want to change the board. And sometimes we can understand that, especially if they're locked in like a proxy fight with an activated investor. So it may not be a good, but then we want a long-term commitment. And then the third one is, I think, is that's the next generation of diversity, is saying, well, yes, we hear the call for greater gender diversity, but we also have lots of people coming to us asking for other dimensions of diversity, racial diversity, veteran status, sexuality, maybe. So all these other dimensions of diversity are coming as well. And that's, I think, a harder nut for us to crack. I think there are wonderful candidates out there who have all these characteristics, but they're hard, perhaps less hard to observe from the outside. So you really have to know someone, and some of them just haven't made it to the top of the leadership yet.
Great, thanks, Jonas. That's fantastic. So we'll move to our next speaker. Atsi Sheth is the managing director. Welcome in Moody's credit strategy and research team. Officer for the Americas. She is responsible for Moody's global macroeconomic and default research teams. Atsi is a longtime champion of Moody's diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as Moody's corporate social responsibility initiatives. Prior to her current role, Atsi was managing director in Moody's Sovereign Risk Group. Atsi has also served as a chief economist at Reliance Capital and taught courses at Bombay University. Warm welcome, Atsi, and good to have you with us today.
To be here.
Great, and you've risen to the top of the finance world, which is not an easy task. From your point of view, how does Moody's encourage a gender equal corporate environment? And the second part of that is, what specific initiatives or programs or actions at Moody's do you believe has been instrumental in promoting careers women's advancement?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Marianne, Lars-Erik, and Jonas have said, because I found myself nodding to almost everything they said. And, I will say one of the things that we at Moody's have been saying a lot recently, and because we believe it's important to say it, is that DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, is in our DNA. That we, it is part of who we are as a company. And by that, we mean that it's part of our values, but it is what adds value to our shareholders and our stakeholders. That, this is something we believe in, it's the right thing to do, but we know how it affects our top line, because the more diversity you have, and this has already been said before, you come out with better outcomes in the products. And in our case, the products are knowledge products. So they're opinions and analysis. And imagine if analytics was done by a group that all went to elite schools, but thought the same way, same background, silver spoons in mouth, you would have worse outcomes. So having these different backgrounds, and they represent themselves in gender, but other types of diversity too. So for our top line, it's important. For our bottom line, it's important because, again, we are a risk firm. So we are a firm that gives opinions on risk management, and we know that diverse opinions matter in spotting risk. People who think the same way will not spot risks where they're glaringly obvious to others who come from a different background. So that's one. I think that we've been very, very clear as to why we pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the right thing to do, yes. It is also the thing that will keep us profitable and sustain our longevity over the long term. So that's why we do it. Now, how do we do it? A number of things. We have made, the managers, the senior most management is responsible for this outcome, is responsible for making sure that Moody's is a welcoming organization to all kinds of diverse talent. But it's not just them, it has to be, and I think Marianne, you said this, has to be down the line. So middle management, senior management, junior, people just entering the workforce have to take responsibility for maintaining this culture of diversity and inclusion. And that's one thing we're very clear about. So I'll just give you a few examples of what we've done. One is, because we're a knowledge organization, a lot of our products are created in meetings. That, rating outcomes are discussed by rating committees. We make sure the person who's chairing a committee has to make sure that every opinion is voiced and every opinion is sort of counted for, no matter how junior or senior or no matter what your background, people have the opportunity to voice their opinion. That's one thing at meetings. Second, if you find, and this is not just the rating committees, but in general meetings, people not speaking up, it is incumbent on the senior most person in the room to ensure that talented people who may be shy, who may not see people around the room that look like them, who speak like them, are encouraged to speak, make it an environment. So it's incumbent on the senior most person to do that. And I think it was you who said, Lauren, that it's not the women aren't doing what they need to advance. Something is structurally wrong. And one of the structural issues is people don't feel empowered to speak up always when people around them look very different and speak very differently. So that's the second thing we do. And then thirdly, we've sort of recognized where the talent drop off is in the United States. And this is a policy issue. Unlike in many countries in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, the US does not have publicly provided childcare. And that tends to be one reason why women who enter the workforce, so we do everything we can to maintain diversity in our recruitment. We do everything we can to promote talent in a very gender neutral and sort of empowering way. However, if you're a person, mid-level professional who has 3 children at home, childcare is tough, you may choose to take a step back in your career. One of the things that we do is we offer a flexible work environment so that people can maintain their career should they choose to do so and still, be there for their family, men and women, by the way, or any gender. So that's another thing that we do. And then I'll sort of stop with this last thing, which is at the senior level, again, going back to what people have said, this idea that, we can't find the right talent, which you hear in other places, you won't hear that said at Moody's. We've made sure that we are empowering people to network. So one of the things we know is what keeps people from being chosen is that they're not seen, that senior management may simply not know you, or middle management may not know you. So one of the things we're doing is, yes, we'll do sort of, courses in executive communication and building executive presence. All of that is very important. But what we do is we provide you channels to network through mentoring programs, through access one-on-ones with leadership. And that way, the leaders who may not have seen you because they don't work with you directly get to see you, and you get to sort of, have a channel up. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the ways that we're trying to build a culture where people are empowered to grow in whatever direction they wish.
That's fantastic. And it seems very conscious on how it's structured and built into what you've identified as some of the challenges of building women into higher up in the corporation. I'm curious, you've mentioned, these 3 fantastic things and, like voicing the opinion and being the senior manager has, ownership and that becomes part of it and all throughout down. I'm curious, is that part of the performance indicator for them? Kind of similar to Marianne had said, if you have like an HR hire and you have to indicate, why are you choosing this over that checking of bias, how is that ownership of, ensuring that everybody in the room is sharing the opinion, et cetera? Is that part of a performance indicator, et cetera?
Indeed, and we do surveys, which I think Lars Erik was talking about, that we do surveys where we ask people who report into a group, do you feel like your opinion is heard? Do you feel included? Do you have a sense of the firm's strategy? Do you feel like you get feedback to advance in your career? And managers who, this feedback is then sort of something that becomes part of the manager's performance. And again, I should say that because this is so much part of the culture, we find that most people, this is how they behave now. As a manager, I know, and I used to be a teacher, as you mentioned, I was shocked to read research that said that, and I think Marianne, you mentioned this, that even women professors tend to call on women less in class. It's not just the male professors not calling on women to speak up in class, even women professors do this. And I happened to read this research when I was a professor, and it made me very conscious of my behavior. So I think people's behaviors, and I think, Jonas, you said this, that, people's behaviors change when they come into contact with diverse talent. And that's what we've been seeing happening. So our survey results tend to be that people are feeling included.
Great, and I could dig into this so much deeper. And just one last question before we move on to Marianne next. I've heard both you and Lars Erik mention that aspect of the surveys, et cetera. So what happens after the survey, right? What if there was actually a mention that, you're seeing a trend that folks are not feeling included, folks are not feeling, which is a common thing, right? What happens then?
We actually make action plans. So one of the things, so inclusion was something that, was not highlighted in our surveys. One of the things we heard from people some time ago was junior people felt that being able to articulate, especially in our quantitative teams, I happen to manage teams that are very quantitatively oriented. So these are people who are brilliant, do extremely complex mathematical modeling, but being able to explain that to a person who may not be a mathematician is a challenge. So they said, we feel like our work is understood by other people who are like us in the company, but it's not understood by even, senior management who may not be sort of deep in the weeds. What do? So we started a program where we have a committee of people who will, you can go in and present in front of them. They will give you feedback as to how to make something accessible. And then you go on to a bigger group where the managing directors and the managing directors' bosses will come and you get to present in front of them. So that way you get your practice with a group that tells you how to present to an executive audience, and then you get to present to that executive audience. So that's one of the things that we did after we received survey feedback, saying, I feel like, yes, I'm included, but I feel like my work is not well understood.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Those are so action-oriented, and great to hear that that's happening at Moody's. Thanks, Atsi. So now moving back to Marianne. Marianne, you sit on several influential boards. One of the things, and our speakers have mentioned this, particularly Jonas, that women have expressed is that at times, and to myself as well, people have said this, it feels that like one is not in the network of power brokers. It's tough to get on a board and never even hear about the opportunities, right? It's kind of like a very closed hush hush. Hey, do you want to get on my board? I don't know. Do you want to get on my board? Do you know who wants to get on the board? And if you're not in that tight knit circle, you just never even know. And so we've talked about this casting wide net. So what are, from your experience, what are 1 to 2 specific actions and steps corporate boards can do to ensure they're casting a broad net for talent outside of their network? To include diverse candidates to join their board. Indeed, it's not just women, but also cultural diversity, racial diversity, etc. And then the second part to it, we have mixed feelings about. But from your experience, what are 1 to 2 specific actions do you recommend for women to be on those boards? How could one? We have several folks on the audience. As a woman, how do you then seek these out as well? So it's kind of a two sides to it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let me start with the latter one, because for sure I hear this question very often also from fellow women that has fantastic resumes and very, very relevant competences, but they never really feel they come into that loop. And today, most board positions are made either through search companies, or they are through the funds that are controlling it. Can be equity funds or or different pension funds or these matters that put in their representatives. And the two boards I'm serving, one of them was through a search company, and the other one was I'm representing one of the funds owning a part of the company. So these are the people that needs to know you. That is, of course, search companies. You need to actively engage with, and that can take years, to build a relationship with the search companies, whether you want board positions or executive positions. But you also need to know people like Jonas that sits in funds that owns companies. And then, of course, you need to know some chairmen or chairwomen, chairpersons, we say these days. These are the decision makers on this, and these are the people women need to know. These people all want to know women, and very often they call me because I tend to be one of the few they know and said, Marianne, do you know some women? And yes, I do know some women. But they don't know where to find them sometimes. But the good thing is that they are actually quite visible. You can just search the webpage and then you can see this is a chairperson of this and that board, or you can see these are the funds that owns the company. So the women can quite easily pull their hand up and reach out to these people. And then I know for a fact they would love to put some women on their boards. As Jonas said, there are no owners or shareholders today that don't want a diverse board, but they simply very often don't know where to find them. So I actually think a lot of this is in the hand of women, because the ones that are making decisions over board compensations these days would really love to have female and males and other dimensions of diversity. So it is actually just a quick Googling, and then you can find the people that you can send an email and you can introduce yourself and you can ask for that cup of coffee. So it's easier for the women to find the decision makers than it is for the decision makers to find a woman. At least it tends to be like that. On the board side, of course, you need to work like you do on managerial positions. You will have a nomination committee. In that nomination committee, you will work structurally with the succession for the executive team, but also for the board. You will look into what are the capabilities we're missing in our board, and currently it's very much around digitalization or around sustainability, which is areas where women tend to have equally strong capabilities. And then it is, of course, the gender diversity or nationalities to cover the reach of the company. So these will be the elements you have a structured plan for in each board. At least every professional board will have a plan for that. What are the next capabilities we need to attract to our board? And then you will either through the nomination committee start to seek in the market and to build a potential pipeline that next time a person on the board needs to change for one or another reason, then it is a profile like this, and you might have some coffee meetings to get to know them and to see if that could fit. Normally you will sit in a board like, let's say, 6 years, so you can also see from a woman from the outside. Is everybody relatively newly elected? Then there's probably not much dynamic. But if there is quite many board members that has been on for a long time, then it might be good to send an introduction in email to the chairman of the board and introduce yourself and say, I can see your board needs to refresh soon, and I have this and that capability that will be of relevance for your board. So it isn't so magic, actually. It is quite straightforward and pretty structured work, and the people you need to reach out to is also pretty not magical black room of men, but it is quite visible who the chairman is, who the owners are, who's sitting in the nomination committee is also on the company's website. So it is not that tricky to figure out. Okay, excellent. That's great, Marianne. And I'm seeing that we've got a ton of questions that are coming through the chat. So I'll incorporate this a bit in relation to this. So I think some of the questions is, one, how does one pitch themselves? Do you just pick up a phone and cold call? So kind of the tactics of that. How does a woman that's interested to be on the board do that? And to what approach would that be? And then I think it's also the aspect is, are there any kind of unknowns that, it might list all these wonderful experiences that's needed, et cetera, but is there kind of like that connection
also with the board members, etc. That's considered. And then the other aspect that I'm seeing pop up is also the term aspect. That's also kind of come up. You know, at times there's just very long-term board members, and you know that aspect is. Have you seen that to come up? Sometimes there's just lifelong board members that it just doesn't move. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Is it me? Yeah. The latter one for sure is still known in many companies, but I also think it is well known that that is not excellent board work to have a board that is never changing. So I would say again, any chairman who is chairing a board with people who has been sitting there for a lifelong time might need a little nudging. Most naturally, it's from the shareholders. The funds and the active shareholders behind the company should, of course, push a chairman that are not making sure that there is a refresh in the board. But if they are not doing it, I think also qualified women could be the one nudging, saying, have you been considering to refresh your board? But of course, that takes a little bit more brave from that individual woman to do like that. I see in the Medebum is asking what strategy did not work in terms of enhancing women at executive levels. And there I would say it's far not enough to have just a strategy and some KPIs on the matter. I've not worked in a company or sitting in a board where they were not having a strategy or some KPIs. And despite that, I've been both working for and sitting in boards where it has been turning the wrong direction. So it doesn't help by itself because this is all about culture. So I think what Atis and Lars Erik was pointing to, you need to ensure it's in working on inclusion more than diversity, to embed it in all of your processes in the company, and also to do some of the measurements that Atsi were pointing to around inclusions. We are doing the same in Microsoft. And I think that is really the trick. So just to have a statement and a strategy and some KPIs around it, whether it's board or executive levels, that actually moves nothing. I've seen it even moving backwards. And as I was putting in the chat, I also think it's much easier, and it happens much more at the moment, to have a good gender representation in the board. But that is either not enough to ensure it happens even in the most executive levels for different reasons. So I think board diversity will be accomplished much faster than executive diversity.
Can I add one thing, Lauren, to what you are saying, Marianne? I think I've seen throughout the 30 years of recruitment and working with talent management and so on, I've seen that often also women downplay themselves a little bit when they are knocking on the door, like you say, Marianne, give a call and so on. And I see often boys and men, we overplay ourselves a little bit. And I constantly see that. And even in some of the psychometrics we are working with, if we ask a man, what is your self-confidence, and he says an 8 on the scale, then we put it down to 6. And if we have a woman who says 6, we put it up to an 8, right, on self-confidence. And I think that is something also, because we say sometimes it's systematic fault, sometimes it has to do with the individual. And I think that is something to think of also, like how do I present myself? How do I work? And I see there is patterns in this one, which I think could be good to be aware of as a woman coming in. And how do you present yourself? I think that could help to have that and see how do we differ, how we present ourselves and work with it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you with that, Lars Erik. Even was recently in a workshop with a couple of great women leaders, and had a hesitation of just saying just how much amazing things that they've, you kind of like, oh, well, no, thank you, with everything that they've done, at the same time, the tactic that was shared there was that just share the facts, Yes, I was the CEO of this company. Yes, I raised $1 billion. I run a unicorn $1 billion company. Yes, I'm doing. Those are all facts. Yeah. That's nothing to, exactly. But so that's a specific tactic that was brought up there, was that, yes, actually I am pretty amazing. And these are the things that I've done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the next, so we actually moved next to you, Lars Erik. So that was great. so you have this long track record working in HR at Ikea and many different departments in many different countries around the world. And I think you might have shared some of this, but what are kind of takeaways on approaches on what works and doesn't work? I think we've talked about what has worked, and I think maybe we can lean a little bit into what should we avoid doing on the diversity inclusion aspect. I think we've gotten some great things on that. And what's made you so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, I think if I start with the passion part, I think that has to do with my living in many different countries around the world. And I feel like, I mean, the similarities are more than the differences. And I mean, every people I meet, they have their heart on the same place. I mean, that's how it is, right? Wherever you go. And I feel sometimes that there are such opportunities for us to be inclusive, to work together, and to have like this more global society where we work together instead of the polarization. So it's just getting bigger and bigger for me how important this is. And I'm working in sustainability, and climate is a threat, but inequality is a big threat as well. And I sometimes think which one is coming first here, and I'm really like onto this. And fighting inequalities, work within sustainability with climate change and unsustainable consumption. So we've decided that this is one of our top 3. And that goes for me personally as well, living around and seeing so many different parts of the world, and how actually working together works better. So this is an important part for me. And then if I say what doesn't really work, I think it's dangerous to go in without having a context. And I've been working, as said, in different, I mean, of course, when I work in Pakistan and I go to Karachi, my view and discussions in the office in Karachi is different from my discussions about diversity and inclusion in an office in Lithuania, Kaunas, or it's in Dortmund in Germany. And I think it's dangerous if you don't respect the context we are coming to, and understand the history has been there for a reason, and a little bit not blaming too much on that either, and saying that that's bad with that kind of how you've done before. It's like, yeah, I understand you have a cultural context, you have a history, and good up till now, but could we embrace the future a little bit and honor your history in this? Because I've gone in myself a little bit too, like, well, hey, here I'm coming to India from Sweden, and I will, fix this kind of attitude, which is, I felt like, it doesn't really move things, because you need to meet, as we said, on the believing level, on the why level. And if you don't match that, you end up in a problem. So I would say that is one of my takeaways on learnings, to bring diversity and inclusion and gender equality, all this into a context of where you are, if it makes sense.
No, that 100%. Before coming to New York is very much for 12 plus years in emerging markets, and indeed definitely different approaches and respect on what the context is, and meeting people where they're at, and moving forward from there. So I absolutely agree with you. And I think the point on it's a very deep question of the inequality and climate, which is more of a threat, et cetera. And it's so much intertwined, right? And who's the most affected. So no, thank you so much for that, Lars-Erik. Thank you. And being conscious of our time, and also just want to make sure we've got 2 more questions for our speakers here, but also want to get to the questions of our audience. So we'll move rather quickly on this next few ones. So Jonas, the next question is for you. In the companies you invest in, and we touched on it already, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper into this, is, the extent, to what extent is gender diversity of its board structure considered in your review to invest or not, which you've shared that it is definitely is, but just kind of getting into the structural aspect of it. Could you share some examples of the steps you do in reviewing that, and what's the potential with potential companies you invest in? And just so that, you're a very influential stakeholder. And so I think getting into your mind of, how that affects your decision, and, how you review that, and, particularly, what our companies can do to to fix that from their end and get the funding support, not just because of the funding support, but as several has mentioned, very much as part of the culture and the why of those companies.
No, thank you for that question. The way we're set up, we're basically invested in all listed company of a certain size. So whether or not gender balance is at a certain level will never be, a go, no go question for us. So we'll invest in the company, and then we'll say, okay, now that we have to elect the board, what does it look like? And now that we have to talk to the chair, what does the composition look like? And we believe, again, we're a sovereign wealth fund. We're the saving mechanism for the Norwegian government. So we don't want to push our political view on companies. And like Lars-Erik was saying, we do take market practice, market standards into consideration. So we would think that, in certain countries, 40% representation, 30% will be unrealistic. But we ask, even in countries that don't, aren't very high on gender diversity, we would still ask them why they don't have a single woman on the board, and then, why don't they have 2 women? So we like the idea of nudging and a bit of stick and carrot as well. We talk to companies, we like to encourage them, as long as companies can convince us that they have a plan and this is something they're serious about and they're thinking about. We can accept most things, but if we feel that they're just blatantly ignoring us, or that they're real outliers where everyone else in the market is doing something, they're doing nothing, then then we could actually vote against the board. But that's a very serious step. So have a plan. That's what I would tell companies: have a plan. Be public about it. When you refresh the board, start with the skills, not the person. Say, we want digitalization, knowledge about Asian markets, sustainability, and then find a person who fits that. Because then it's easier to find man or woman or any kind of other dimension you want. And then just keep talking to us and be public about what you do, because then it's easier for us to assess it.
Do you have, and this is the last question, is for you, Jonas, do you have a kind of, before going into those discussions, like a set of expectations, and is that included in those set of expectations when you have the discussion? So,
absolutely.
It's written in.
Yes, and anyone who goes to our website will find that we have a paper on climate change, or expectations on board independence, or on very technical matters like related party transactions. But these things are important for shareholders. But we put our expectations out there so everyone knows where we're coming from. There are no surprises. And then we will send them to companies, respectfully reminding them that this is our position, and in the future this may influence our voting. So this is the stick and carrot approach that I talked about.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jonas. That's great.
Of course, Laurie. My pleasure.
And so now we've got our last question to Atsi, and then we'll have a fire round of 1 minute on 2 questions for all the panelists, and moving right into the audience talk. So Atsi, just to anchor our work on data and research, Moody's puts a lot of emphasis on gender equality, not only in company programs, but also in its research. Gender and finance is the key focus area, and Moody's publishes a lot of research on topic, as you had mentioned. What are some, the key findings, 1 or 2, in your research that reinforce the importance of gender equality in companies, which we've touched upon, but if there was 1 or 2 that you would highlight, what would they be?
Sure. And just a couple, as sort of a background, the reason Moody's does this, we are a risk assessment company. And why are we talking about gender equality? Because we believe it affects risk. So one of the things we've done a whole bunch of research in emerging markets and advanced economies. I'll just share 2. One is we looked at our ratings, which are essentially an assessment of a company or a country's ability to repay debt. So very much dependent on balance sheets, income statements, business models, things that are very, very quantitative in nature. And we looked at the ratings for companies in Europe and in the US, where we have a large number of companies rated. And we found a correlation between your rating and your board diversity. So if you were rated AAA, you would have a much more diverse, gender diverse board than if you were rated BBB, and which would be much more gender diverse than rated CCC, which is the lower level. But even at the higher levels, what was the percentage? 25 to 30%. So it wasn't parity even at the highest levels. And I think that sort of echoes what you all are saying. At the country level, again, we looked at the same thing, and we found that gender equity very much linked to your rating. But is it, because all countries have a certain amount of women in their population. So it's really the women's inclusion into the workforce, women's pay levels, things like that are what sort of explained it. And we found again that the richer a country is, the more likely to have more gender equity. But among rich countries, there's a big divergence. The US lags its other advanced economy counterparts in gender equity, which is something that, because I'm representing the US on this panel, I'll leave you with one last thing, that again, it's not what women are doing. For 30 years now, in the United States, women are graduating college at equal or higher rates annually than men for 30 years. Why are we not seeing them more in the C-suite and in higher echelons? Is it something they're doing? Perhaps. Is it something companies are doing? Perhaps, but something needs to change. So I'll leave it at that, just to be in the interest of time.
Keeping us hanging, and definitely something that's on all of our minds, Etsy. And so now we're going to go into just 1 minute each. So we've got 2 questions, and we'll just go around on this. So it kind of goes into that last point that you had, Etsy. So there's a debate of whether targets and quotas are needed in order to reach gender parity, or even just better gender balance, right, in corporate leadership and boards. What is your opinion on this, and based on what you've seen and not seen work and not work? And just a minute each, and we'll start with, we'll go with Marianne first, Lars Erik, Jonas, and then Etsy.
Thank you. I firmly believe that it is important that we have vision, strategies, and targets for everything, whether it is diversity in boards and executive levels, or sustainability, or financial performance, or impact on the societies we operate in. I for sure do believe it's a minimum start. But as I said before, it doesn't really matter if that's all there is. So we need to back it up with strategies need to go into concrete plans. We need to embed it in all of our processes, and we need to work with the ongoing cultural transformation. And that is where the devil is. And that's probably also why, to Atsy's point, that working on inclusion is what will bring us forward, because diversity should have been accomplished 30 years ago. It was purely on competences, but it is about culture. So yes, we need the KPIs, but it is not really anything on its own, in my opinion, and in what I've seen.
Gotcha. 100% agree with you, Marianne. Lars Erik?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Marianne as well. So in that it's the same. I don't believe in forcing anything on this. You can be really tough on the goal setting and so on, and demand that, I mean, like any goals that you expect them to have a diversity in the board or whatever. But not enforced in any way, or having quotas and so on. I don't believe that, because it goes back to what I say. If you don't believe with it from your value system, it doesn't really matter. Then you bring in some, I would say, poor person where the context around them doesn't really support that they have come in with a diverse view or anything. So for sure, it starts with your value system, and you can be tough on goals for sure. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Lars Erik. Jonas?
I think targets and goals and public reporting about achievement toward those goals is essential. I think companies should set them so we understand where they're heading. I think we have set them as an investor, and I think it's a good thing for other investors to set as well. Whether governments want to set them, that's not something that we as a fund and as a sovereign wealth fund have a position on. So that's up to each government and each regulator to decide.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jonas. Etsy?
Yeah, and I'd echo the point on disclosure, that I think disclosure is a first step. Mandates are again, up to regulators to decide, but disclosure itself can lead to discussion and lead to strategic changes. So that would be one thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is that diversity is a means to get it at an end. The end is sustainable growth, better decisions, better outcomes. So that should be really the focus. And if you focus on that, you will get diversity, because diversity is the only way to get to that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So last question on our fire round is, if we are to reach gender diversity and inclusion in corporate leadership and boards, what is the one action that corporates or boards can do today? And then we'll move into the audience questions after this. And we will start, again, same order, Marianne, Lars-Erik, Jonas, and Atsi. And feel free to just unmute yourself.
Oh, one thing, I actually, as I said before, I don't believe one thing can do it. I think it is, you have to work from all angles at the same time. But if I were to point to one, it would probably be the disclosure. You year over year have to report on your progress, because it will be embarrassing for everybody to report either status quo or the even rolling back. So disclosure of progress.
Yep. I agree, because there's also so much commitments out there. And again, 30 years, the discussion, I don't want my daughters having this discussion 30 years from now and still, like, we're still having that. And then nothing is disclosed on how exactly everyone is doing. Thanks for that. I totally agree. Lars-Erik?
Yeah, I would say it is a mindset shift. I would ask for the board, and I mean it's a hygiene factor for the future generations coming into the market. They say it's a hygiene factor. They would even wonder, why are you discussing these different parts? Of course, it should be natural, right? So it's like if the board or the decision makers in the company doesn't have this, I mean, you need to start with them there. Like, what mindset do you have for the future growth? Like Atsi said, do you want to grow? Then you need to get your act together on your attitude around this or approach.
I agree.
Jonas? I would agree with thank you. Sorry, Lauren. I would agree with Marianne. I think disclosure is the one thing that matters. If you disclose, then you can't really hide anywhere. You can't hide from your customers. You can't hide from your shareholders. You can't hide from the public. You can't hide from regulators. So more disclosure.
Great.
That's my answer.
I'd agree with everything everyone said. And I would just say that if the reason for the board not to be diverse is we can't find the people, look harder, look better.
Exactly.
This whole pipeline aspect is just not holding water, but definitely agree on the disclosure. All right. So if you can give me a second, I will go right into our Q&A, which is overflowing. You just give me a second here. Okay. Does any of the panelists, and please just, whoever wants to chime in, go ahead. Does any of the panelists work with a bonus structure on an executive level in order to secure gender equality and diversity? So is there a financial kind of bonus in order to do that? Or kind of a carrot, if we'll stick with Jonas's.
I can give it just briefly, and Jonas can probably fill in here even more. I see more and more boards are putting ESG into the bonus schemes of CEOs, and diversity is a part of the ESG. Of course, there is a lot of focus on sustainability footprint as part of the ESG bonus component, but I would say diversity is getting included. It is new, but it's getting there.
No, exactly. I would echo that. And as we know, incentives drive behavior. And if you find good ways of including diversity targets, that could be a good way. This is typically something that we leave to the board because we don't want to micromanage companies. So I'm just relating what I've observed, but I believe it definitely has an effect if it's well designed.
Okay, excellent. I think, so this question goes to Lars-Erik. It's very much specific to IKEA. Mm-hmm. Lars-Erik, IKEA has worked with diversity for as long as I can remember. You've had folks working in the workhouses, for example, you've had diversity programs, etc. What is the most important bottom line outcome you would highlight IKEA has, the first and foremost, which is the direct result of these diversity efforts?
So if I understand the question is what is the
So I think it's more to rephrase it. It's that the diversity programs that you're doing, can you do a direct correlation to your bottom line of how your diversity efforts have improved your bottom line? So either on we've talked about the consumer base a bit, even on the innovation and etc.
Yeah. I would say so. And I think that is one of the reasons why it is strong in IKEA, that we actually see that it has an effect, as all of us has talked about. And you can't say we are a very creative retailer, innovative and entrepreneurial if you don't embrace diversity. It doesn't really fit into it. So I think it has a correlation to our bottom line. And also we are very clear on our values and like to discuss them. I like that. And you can't talk about togetherness without embracing this as well. So I think definitely it has to do with the bottom line. And people stay a long time in IKEA, and retention good. To retain people is good money also, to keep them in the company. So I think there is a lot of bottom line results into this.
Okay, excellent. And a bit of follow on to that, and maybe Jonas and Marianne can chime into this. But Lars-Erik, this is, I think, also, since you work with all of you work with global companies, is that, you have your corporate values. However, the question is here, in all different locations has different contexts, as you'd mentioned, Lars-Erik, right? So how does a company ensure that there's kind of a common thread on this DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative on a global perspective, where you do have the corporate values, but to what extent do you adjust that to, let's say, from Denmark to the Philippines to India, etc.?
I think if I start there, I think it goes back to what we said before. You need to find where is the intersection between the corporate values and the values in the countries and the people values, and see what are the overarching parts where you can say this we agree on, and then this seems to be a bit far from each other, and how can we then interpret and nurture the corporate culture with the local culture that you have, and see where do you have the commonalities, but respect that maybe certain parts is coming from different angles, and then openly talk about it. I think it's not like, you need to bring it to the surface, saying, hey, this is interesting. Here we seem to have a different view, like how we treat men and women and this office and so on. Could we see a nationality, cultural aspect of it? Dare to talk about it, actually. So I let some others in as well. You have international experience of all of us.
No, I fully agree. I think diversity has to be a globally shared value, and it has to be without negotiable. But what diversity is, inclusion of Hispanic, for example, is a big topic in US. It's not really a topic in the Nordics. We don't have large Hispanic communities. We will focus in the Nordics on women, but also on Muslim background or Muslim cultural elements. Disabilities is another angle of diversity that are becoming more and more relevant. And that is, of course, even more important in societies where you don't have public welfare for disabilities than it is in countries with that. But it is, so I think you have to share globally the commitment to diversity, but then the specific groups that you have to include and how difficult it is also different. The inclusion of homosexuals, it's much more difficult and hard in Catholic societies than it is in Protestantic societies and so on. So there are many angles to this, and the topics that are of relevance and are difficult are of course different in each part of the world.
And maybe just to add, I think that the direction of travel is the same wherever you are, but the starting points are different and the speed of travel is different. And we acknowledge that. So we would never say, expect the same kind of gender representation today in, say, Japan as in the UK, just to take two large economies, because everyone knows that, that the female participation in the workforce in Japan is lower in Japan than it is in the UK. But we expect Japan to develop, and indeed the government and regulators in Japan are encouraging that themselves. So, as I say, different starting points and different speed of travel, and that needs to be taken into account.
Gotcha. And then just switching into the policy aspect, and Atsia, I'm going to go to you. One of the questions here is that indeed the U.S. as our U.S. representative is quite lagging. And you mentioned childcare and the policies on that. That's something even New York City is very hard working on, but definitely not to the level that our Nordic counterparts have. And so what would be one or two things that can really jumpstart that or just really move it even further as far as on the policy side that you're seeing from a country level?
Sure, and I'll link it to what Jonas just said, is that one of the things we found is that Japan and Korea, for instance, in the East, have indeed instituted policies to get more women into the workforce. And this comes at a time, in Japan's case, where the population is actually falling. So you reached a point in time in many countries across the world where your labor force is not growing at the same pace, or in some cases shrinking. And if you've left half your labor force out of it already, you're at an even further disadvantage. So, I think driven by, yes, equity considerations, but also by pure economics considerations, countries are, enabling policies that will bring more women into the workforce. That's one. Second, we found that if, we just did a study of countries with higher female labor force participation versus lower, just advanced economies all. And we found productivity growth was higher when you had more female labor force participation. So again, very value-driven reason to have more female labor force. Coming to the US, which was your question, it lags. There is no national policy in the US. The US is a federal structure. So the states make a lot of social policy, whether it's health insurance type stuff, or, we now have a national health insurance policy, but family leave, for instance, so maternity leave policies, and they're not national, pay during maternity leave, the kind of, coverage you have, medical coverage for having a baby, things like that, childcare, none of that is national. So that's one reason why the US, women in the workforce tend to have less of a public policy support structure. So that's certainly one reason. The other is that if we're talking about the corporate level, if you think of the two industries in the US that sort of are high income, high earning, high growth, finance and technology, not a lot of representation of women in their ranks. Why is that? And I don't have a very clear answer, but a couple of things. One is that they may not be very attractive to women because of what they've sort of exhibited to the outside world, that these are very competitive, cutthroat, etc., and women may not be attracted to it. But the other is that they've not made the effort to recruit and retain. One thing that people sometimes say is, well, they're doing just fine, aren't they, without women? They're high earning, high growth. And I always say, well, think of what they could have been with women along the way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Atsi. That's great. And I think that's a great, I know we're 2 minutes to time. So I think that's a great stopping point where we're able to really address some of very, very specific actions that you all are doing on both the corporate board and also on even the policy level, which I highly echo. And, my sense is that first of all, there's no doubt that there's a lot of work to do. And my sense is there's a paradigm shift in urgency in creating more gender diverse corporate leadership and boardrooms. And Jonas, I love the things that you're doing with your 9,000 plus companies as well. I think those, the carrot and stick approach is very good. And then, just listening from all of you today, before I hand it over to Victoria, our organizer today, is just that, even for on looping that back on the personal front, I have cautious optimism to say, with that 30 years from now, that our daughters and the next generation of women have moved further into these conversations. And I love that last point on the disclosure aspect that I think a lot of us were nodding our heads to. So I think those are some very specific things that I think will hold accountability to the corporates and the boardrooms. And I love that how we've anchored it also on the bottom line. It's not so much about gender, as Marianne had mentioned, but it's about people. at the end of the day. But with that said, I'll hand it over to, thank you so much to our amazing speakers. I could speak to you all day, and I know our audience could listen all day to you. But we'll hand it over to Victoria for the final words today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I believe you have said it all. You wrapped it up so nicely with including the point on towards people, which was the first thing that Marianne said today. So thank you so much on behalf of the Consulate General of Denmark in New York. Thank you to all our guests, and we had a lively chat. Those questions that we didn't address, we'll get back to you on those. But thank you so much to everyone, and we ended on the spot, on the second actually. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.